you all so much for coming. I'm Ann Kneeland, and I'm with Community Rights Lane County, and we are the group that has put on this panel. Thank you. Thanks, everyone, for coming. So as you probably know, unless you are wrongly here, you are at the Art of Chemical Warfare, Oregon Community Democracy versus Industrial Timber and State Government in the Battle to End Aerial Spraying. And I'm here with these three esteemed individuals who are going to speak to us today. And then at the end, we'll have an opportunity for questions. So prepare yourselves. To my immediate left is Evan Vallianatos. He has a bachelor's degree, master's degree, and doctoral degrees in zoology, Greek medieval history, and the history of science. He went on from a lot of very great and fascinating schooling to spend 25 years working at the Office of Pesticide Programs for the Environmental Protection Agency in California, right? Oh no, you were in DC, okay. And he is the author of Poison Spring, The Secret History of Pollution and the EPA, among other books that are well worth investigating to learn more about what goes on at the Environmental Protection Agency, particularly with respect to pesticides. Sitting next to him is Carol Van Strum. Carol is a writer, editor, editor, farmer, parent, and chronic thorn in the side of those who endanger the health and safety of people and the environment. And she lives and works in the Oregon Coast Range. She is the author of Bitter Fog, The Herbicides and Human Rights. Is that the correct title? Okay. And she is this year's recipient of the David Brower Lifetime Achievement Award. And Carol also was volunteered to step up as a petitioner in the lawsuit that was filed to defend the ordinance passed in Lincoln County to ban the aerial spray of pesticides last year. She stepped up to represent the Siuslaw River watershed in an effort for that river ecosystem to intervene in the case. And while the judge denied that request to intervene, I think what she was willing to do moved forward a really important step in our legal system in terms of moving towards recognizing the legal rights of natural communities and ecosystems, and having nature possess and exercise rights within our judicial system and broader society. So it's really a big deal. And the fight goes on. And I hope when you want to learn more about rights of nature, you'll join us for our Sunday morning panel at 9 o'clock in the Longhouse. And sitting next to her is Rio Davidson. Rio is the owner of Cascade Coast Solar. It is a building and remodeling construction company that works on homes and installs solar panels. He is a founding member of Lincoln County Community Rights. And he's an invaluable member of that group who organized to move forward an initiative petition to ban the aerial spraying of pesticides in Lincoln County. That was an undertaking that, well, lasted several years, but was successfully put on the ballot last May, and then immediately challenged by the timber industry representatives. And he also is part of the Lincoln County Community Rights that intervened in that case. And we went to hearing on that case last year, and we still wait for the judge's decision. So that ordinance is in effect, so we can savor the moments that important community rights initiative is on the books, and continue to work for more. Before I turn the mic over to Evan, I just wanted to say a few words about the community rights work that's being advanced by Community Rights Lane County and also by Lincoln County Community Rights. We are an educational nonprofit that seeks to educate the members of the Lane County community in an effort to put into law our right to pass laws that protect our health, safety, and welfare. So that's to pass laws that achieve social, economic, racial, and environmental justice in our community and stand up to the powers of corporations that work to have the opposite effect. This is this is hard work, but it's the work that must be done. And so we come together to continue to advance that struggle. And I think the reason, although we all kind of very quickly jump aboard the idea that we as a community should have rights to protect ourselves, it immediately comes into this kind of cognitive dissonance with the fact that as a community and as a country, we the people feel incredibly disempowered. And that has a perfectly logical explanation. And that explanation is that we lived in a system of rigged laws and rigged government activity. And that is a body of a structure of law and a system of government, a structure of government and a system of laws that really protects and preserves corporate power. And it is institutionalized in our Constitution, and therefore in all of the statutory and other constitutional laws that stems from that original U.S. Constitution. And so it's up against those barriers that we strive to elevate the rights of people over the rights of corporations. And we invite everyone here, those of who are not already engaged, to join us in this effort. It needs to be a nationwide effort fundamentally, but for now we are moving forward initiatives in our own communities to say that we the people have greater rights than corporations to pass laws that protect ourselves. And the way that actually takes shape is looking at the whole array of harms that are being wrought upon us by corporate activities in our communities. And in Lane County and in Lincoln County and elsewhere in Oregon, that in this case has taken the shape of aerial spraying of herbicides and pesticides. And what has happened in Oregon is that we very much have become aware that we don't have the power in our communities to stop this corporate practice, because our state law has made it a legal activity and has made it a lawful activity that essentially corporate timber industry companies can continue to practice without respect to the harms that they're causing to individuals, to animals, to ecosystems, water, soil, and air, and the like, through their timber practices. So today we're going to investigate that a little bit further. We'll hear more from Evan about how that has taken shape in our regulatory agencies, from Carol how it has taken shape in her efforts through the judicial system, and also Rio in terms of his efforts in his community. And I hope we all today get a better understanding that the work that we do at the local level is very important in terms of really bringing the people together to harness the power we do have and to work to take down the corporate power that will ultimately lead to our extermination. So with that, I'll turn it over and dutifully transfer.
I'm delighted to be here with you, and since I spent 25 years at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, I know a little bit about what's going on. And as you heard, I put all the stories in a book called Poison Spring, The Secret History of Pollution at the U.S. EPA. The whole idea of the EPA came about in the late 60s. It matured and became a reality in December 1970. And this became about because the 60s, and in fact before the 50s, was a time of really ecological upheaval. In 1953, you had fire. A whole river in Ohio caught fire. In 1962, we have Rachel Carson writing a wonderful book, Silent Spring, in which she warned us about all these disasters. She said, she talked about the ecology of life and the killing of honeybees, the killing of birds by all this different variety of chemicals, many of which came out of World War I, that is neurotoxins. She spoke especially about DDT, which was an organochlorine, and it was like what we have today is the Roundup or glyphosate. It had tremendous effects all over the country, and the farmers thought this was a solution to all their problems. So they used it excessively, and it contaminated rivers, lakes. It killed, of course, billions of insects and thousands of birds and millions of birds and so on. So by the time that Nixon signed his name in the executive order bringing EPA into power, there was really a necessity for a creation of an agency like that. And in fact, Nixon, I have to give him credit, because in a kind of a speech he gave to Congress, he said, look, we have to come to peace with nature. We have to stop fighting against nature. And in fact, he spoke about reparations to the natural world. But as soon as the EPA was created, it did a number of very good things, like banning of DDT. And the banning of DDT, of course, brought a kind of a onslaught against the EPA and against the environmentalists. The chemical industry had already done that against Rachel Carson. They had called her a spinster, stupid communist, and all the other things. And they turned around and they called EPA the same names. And of course, they got together with the industry and they decided they had to do something to control this excessive power of the federal government to control and to ban, for instance, a chemical as widely used as that of DDT. I got to the EPA in 1979, and by that time, a number of disasters had already been taking place, and slowly I began to learn about it because I began to ask questions. And my colleagues, many of them were very unhappy about what they were doing. We were having lunch, and they would bring documents to me. So slowly I developed a small library, and realizing that no matter how much I protested, how many memos I wrote, nothing would happen. I decided to write a book, and eventually I did write the book. So the book is made out of a number of stories illustrating the collusion between the industry and the government, the kind of bad science that government actually used to so-called do cost-benefit analysis, and in order to justify the position of the industry. I will tell you a few things about a story that has to do with Oregon. And this one is about the Alsea story. I'll call it Alsea story. And this is 1978. A number of women in that community realized that they were having dead children, babies without brains. So they say, why? What's going on? So they wrote a letter to the administrator of EPA explaining the situation. And the EPA administrator then, 1978, was a guy working for Jimmy Carter, who was a Democrat. So in a sense, he agreed. So they sent EPA investigators to Alsea. And they looked around, and they eventually found tetradioxin, which is the most acutely molecule on Earth. They found it in a creek very close to the homes of these ladies who were having these horrendous problems. And they decided, of course, this was coming out of the strain of 2,4,5-T and 2,4-D. These are the two components that the US Army used as the Agent Orange in the war in Vietnam. So making a connection between the contaminant of 2,4,5-T, that is the tetradioxin, and the deadly birth defects of the women, it was a death kiss to 2,4,5-T. So the EPA in 1979 restricted the chemical, but it took down to 1983 to eventually ban it. But in that process, in that time, they also decided that EPA would never touch 2,4-D, which is still in effect in the United States. Not only that, but they're using 2,4-D also as part of the genetic engineering. They created the GMOs. So with this reality, what happened is that when other women in other parts of the state of Washington discover that this is what the Oregon women did, they wrote a similar letter to EPA in 1979. And then also other women in Oregon, in the Five Rivers area, which is close to Alsea, they wrote another letter in 1979 describing similar medical conditions. And EPA again sent the same. No, in fact, they contracted that project to the university, to Colorado State University, and they did the investigation, and they took samples, and this is where the whole thing fall apart, because they sent all these samples to an EPA laboratory in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi. And then they send it to Nebraska. And the Nebraska guy sent the results to another person at EPA who neglected to report to his superior that there were effects of the dioxin. And by the time 1979 came about, and early 80s came about, you had a wonderful congressman here, Jim Weaver. Jim Weaver began to ask questions of the EPA, and he said, let me see the results of your analysis or whatever. And EPA was caught in this mess. They couldn't say they didn't do it, they couldn't say they did it. And they said it was a mix-up because one of the results that they found had tremendous amount of tetradioxin. And in order to justify that, they said this is not from Oregon, but it comes from Michigan. And Michigan, then you connect it with Dow Chemical because Dow Chemical has a massive factory producing all these chemicals in Michigan. And that tetradioxin, of course, had leached into the rivers in Michigan and to the Great Lakes. So eating fish out of that, it would cause tremendous problems. And then the Reagan administration comes in late 1980. In 1981, they take over. They appoint a woman from Colorado to begin to become the EPA administrator. And this lady, the first thing she does, she fires all the lawyers. All the lawyers that were there to enforce the law. This is Ann Gorsuch's legacy. She had as a deputy a professor of engineering from I think New Mexico University, John Hernandez, who took his task to do what? To, in a sense, say that Dow Chemical is free. I mean, it has nothing to do with it. So he passed a study that the EPA did in Chicago. We have a regional office in Chicago. And these guys had discovered the dioxin into the fish of the Great Lakes. And they were saying most of the dioxin comes from the factories, the gigantic facilities of Dow Chemical in Michigan. So John Hernandez passes that report to Dow Chemical itself. And Dow Chemical, of course, in telephone calls with the EPA high officials, said you need to delete all these references from your report, including deleting the name of the acid study. And of course, this was such a blatant intervention that eventually, Reagan, despite his dismantling of the EPA, he decided to have all these guys fired. The administrator, the deputy administrator, and a woman from California that had made a terrible mess with the toxic waste program. So what does this tell you? It tells you that the industry has tremendous power. In fact, I mean, I was a junior, low-level worker at EPA. I could see all these lobbyists coming almost every day, having luncheons and then giving seminars. And the interesting thing is that here you are. You have an organization like the EPA that most of the people have doctor's degrees in toxicology, biology, ecology, you name it, and they have it. It's a fantastic organization if you don't interfere, if you don't allow these polluters to change their minds. And then they would get to a room like this, and the polluters would set up all sorts of slides like this, all nicely dressed with suits. And the EPA scientists, they would listen to them like graduate student listens to a professor. I mean, the whole idea was really a farceful one because the data of the lobbyists was half truth or lies. And of course, the economists among themselves, they were telling them, if you don't do this, guess what? The food price will go up because we're going to move from this chemical to another chemical that will cost even more money. And the whole idea was just around money and around enabling the chemical industry to continue what it does and keeping wraps under people that were blowing the whistle, like me. I mean, I was talking to congressional staff anytime I had the opportunity. I was letting them see the actual documents, not listen to me. And I said, do something about it. And during the Reagan administration, by the way, the House was Democratic. Therefore, you could use the authority of the committee to demand the testimony of the officials under oath. And then you would get to why dioxin is doing what it does and so on. And so this is the nexus of corruption, unfortunately. And the only way you can deal with that is not to abolish EPA, but to actually isolate the EPA from this political influence. Now, we live in an area of Trump. Trump, of course, is as bad or worse, probably worse, than Reagan. Reagan actually did tremendous amount of damage to the EPA. And how did he do the damage? He did the damage with so-called deregulation. And what did deregulation mean? The vice president of Reagan was George Walker Bush, the old Bush. And he would go to agencies like the EPA and said, look, we need to examine what projects are you funding. And if the project was controversial, he said, just do it, delay it, just forget about it. So slowly, the important priorities of the government were just solved around in order to not to come up with new evidence of toxicity of this chemical or that chemical. And the same thing happened with the dioxin. I mean, the dioxin, after the collection that they did it in Alsea, they kept it under wraps so that all the hundreds of thousands of American soldiers coming from Vietnam, those that had been affected because they were spraying the chemicals all over the jungles of Vietnam, they couldn't get compensation because the Department of the Pentagon and the Department of the Veterans Affairs, they say, we have no evidence that your problem is actually connected to the spraying that you did in Vietnam. And this is the kind of massive fraud that went out for several years until the evidence came out, and eventually the problem was corrected. They banned 2,4,5-T, but then of course 2,4-D is still in existence and is still contaminated with dioxin. So I mean, there are so many stories you can actually tell. I'll tell you one more story and I will stop. This story has to do with the testing of the chemicals. You know, the industry says we have an active ingredient. And then they test it, they send it out to be tested, supposedly tested. And then they take that, the active ingredient, and they wrap it around with a number of other untested chemicals, which EPA calls as inerts, I-N-E-R-T-S. That means they are like water. And of course, when you put these chemicals together, they potentiate each other. They make them, the total product becomes even more toxic. So, and no one, of course, tests that. So the EPA approves that 7 parts per million, for instance, of this chemical will go into bananas. So you eat a banana, you think you don't sense anything or anything at all. But the impact of that 7 parts per million must be much greater than what you actually think. The only reason they put that so-called tolerance is to avoid to be sued by lawyers, so that the farmers get protection, legal protection, and the manufacturers get legal protection from you, that you may die by eating bananas or whatever else you may eat. And this is a kind of a systematic fraud. And in the testing of chemicals, by the way, we have a history of a fantastic grand laboratory, the Industrial Biotest, that for 25 years was actually faking things up. They were making things up. They had hundreds of animals, tested them, and the ones that develop growth, they junked them. They replaced them with new animals. Monsanto has its own scientists within that laboratory to supervise a fraudulent study for one of its chemicals. And this is and a colleague of mine, Adrian Gross, discovered all that in 1976. And he was telling me, and we became very close friends, and for 10 years our offices were next to each other, so we talked for hundreds of hours, and he gave me everything he ever written. He was a wonderful man, and he had a fantastic knowledge of pathology. He was telling me you need 15 years of experience to identify the cancer in the slide that you actually watch. And he spoke about dozens and dozens of different varieties of cancer. And so he was telling me that once in one of the lab inspections, a laboratory clerk gave him a piece of paper with numbers and descriptions of what was happening in the laboratory, all neatly written. And he said, the moment I saw that, I knew there was trouble. He said, because once you are in a laboratory, you are not really that careful. You know, water might actually drop on this, and you use different pens. So with that suspicion, he went with more inspectors from the Federal Drug Administration. And that time, he used to work for the Federal Drug Administration. And he discovered that massive corruption in that laboratory outside of Chicago. And after they discovered that almost 40% of all chemicals in this country had been tested by that laboratory. So the question is, after all this fraud came out into the surface, what to do with the chemicals that already were in actual use and in your food and in your drinking water? They came up with the excuse that we have complementary studies. Minor studies supposedly supporting the same idea that it's safe to eat. And of course, that's not necessarily true. So many of the chemicals that we have had and the problems they have caused are directly connected to the IBT fraud. And it wasn't just IBT. They discovered a number of other laboratories which eventually they began to shut down in the 80s. But then at the same time, through the deregulation, EPA began to have less and less people doing this lab audit program. So when I started, for instance, we had 12 laboratories supporting the pesticide programs. By the time I retired in 2004, there were only 2. So you can see what was going on. Slowly, the manpower and the scientific capabilities were diminished, while the industry kept in its own ways. And it kept going, and it continues to do today. And I presume right now with the Trump, everything that I tell you probably is exacerbated, because when the Republicans come in, they threaten you. And when the Democrats come in, they smile at you, and they say everything is fine. But at the same time, they keep all these lobbyists coming in and out. And they keep talking to them. They keep doing their bidding. And the political appointees, the assistant administrators, they're like princes. They decide. And it doesn't matter whether the ecologist has written a memorandum saying that all the honeybees are dying because of the neonicotinoids or the organophosphates like parathion, that they used to die for 30 to 40 years. In fact, I even wrote a letter about the honeybees too, article. And I kept talking to the guys that were very much involved, and they were showing me the pictures. They had delivered to me all the memos they wrote to their supervisors about honeybees, and it was just appalling sort of indifference on the part of their supervisors. The ecologists were telling them, don't register this stuff on any more crops. You know, have a moratorium so we can actually decide and find out what's going on. But instead of, they extended the approval of the chemical in more crops, and therefore more honeybees would die. Well, in a sense, that's it. I thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to answer some questions you may have.
Pass that to Carol.
Oh, okay. Well, it's hard to, that's a hard act to follow, I gotta say. But what I love about what Evan's book does is it validates everything that we ever said in A Bitter Fog, because there were things we knew must be going on in EPA, but we weren't there. He was. And what we were seeing, of course, was the result, which was women having birth defects, children with birth defects, women having miscarriages, or what what EPA and the Forest Service called spontaneous abortions. And in fact, one woman even made a sign that she put up on Five Rivers Road saying, "Free abortions, call U.S. Forest Service," and gave a phone number. That's how common the knowledge was in the local community out there. And not just in our local community, but in the communities of Deadwood and parts of Southern Oregon. It was like everybody knew, but no one knew what to do about it. And it wasn't until it was actually the animals that tipped me off. Besides my own children getting sprayed, seeing the dead animals in the river, the dead crayfish, the dead fish, the merganser ducklings floating belly up. And this was right after roadside spraying that went right into the river, because our roads all run along rivers and creeks. And nobody could give us an answer about what caused it. We thought they just put the wrong thing in their tanks or something, you know? What did we know? And oh no, it's just 2,4-D and 2,4,5-T. It's safe as table salt. Man, do they love that analogy, safe as table salt. But it was from that experience that I responded to an article in our local paper by a person, I won't call him gentleman, named Michael Newton, who was then a professor of forestry and something else at Oregon State University, proclaiming how the wonders of these herbicides and how they were transforming forestry and they were going to make these commercial trees grow faster. And he even had the nerve to call himself a forest pediatrician because he was helping these little trees to grow after they clear cut and had to spray everything in sight to keep the brush down and then plant their Douglas firs. So that was the beginning. I wrote an answer to that and just said, well, maybe that's his experience, but here's ours. And as a result of that, people in our community came together and ended up hiring a lawyer because we couldn't get answers from anybody. No one was going to listen to us. A letter that I wrote to the Audubon Society got forwarded to Dow Chemical Company. So you can see what we were up against. Which is so bizarre because it was a very recent development, the use of herbicides in forestry. Come on. It turns out, well, they banned them in Vietnam because of the birth defects and the effects on the ecosystem there in 1970. And within 2 years, suddenly these same chemicals, Agent Orange, are being promoted as the saviors of our forests. Well, is there a connection? Of course. Because the entire U.S. industry production of those two chemicals was diverted and increased by the military during the years they used it in Vietnam, which was roughly from 1960 to 1970. And they were building new plants. They were just roaring into production to keep up with military demand. And suddenly it's banned. They can't use it there. What are they going to do with all this stuff? And the answer was, we're going to promote it for use in forestry, on roadsides, on railroad right-of-way, on rangelands, where all the cattle and milk cows graze, well, anyway, and on our rice fields. Those were the major uses they pushed these chemicals on. And within a very few years, this became the conventional practice of agriculture. I mean, and what the old ways of doing it that worked just fine, suddenly we're a bunch of Luddites for even suggesting that we can do without these chemicals. And that's what people are still up against today. They are still made to feel like the lunatic fringe for even raising the question of these chemicals causing harm, when originally their whole purpose was to kill. And that's what we're up against, is license to kill or not. That's what the government has given these agencies. And that's how the ALCE study began, was with, I think it was 8 original women.
Yes.
From with both ALCE and Five Rivers Right of Way. We're very close. We're in the same watershed. And wrote a letter to EPA. And what you might not know is that letter was actually thrown in a bin with thousands of comments on EPA's proposal to re-register 2,4,5-T. And it was only discovered by a wonderful person called Eric Jansen, who was he was an heir to a huge tobacco industry fortune, who turned all of his life and his fortune into fighting the very practices that the tobacco industry used to promote itself. And one of the things that he was fighting was birth defects at that time in America. And he saw this letter, and he made thousands of copies of it, and he was going around to every congressional office, anyone he could talk to get some action on this. And because of that, EPA sent in their initial investigators. And from that point on, the story Evan tells is true, except for when you come to those samples that EPA covered up, because Michael Gross, I love the fact that we have two heroes named Gross in this story. Michael Gross was a chemist at the University of Nebraska who had analyzed those samples and sent the results to EPA in 1980. And for 4 years, we were trying to get those very results. And EPA not only had them, but had submitted them in their 245T cancellation proceedings. But then under Reagan, those all got suspended, and all the records were just sitting there because they, under the Reagan administration, they were going to actually reach a settlement and bring those chemicals back on the market. So EPA was lying to us for all those years, saying those samples never were analyzed. And it was only thanks to Michael Gross sending us his results, because he had no idea they were covering them up. And we happened to call him up. In fact, it was an attorney from here, Michael Axline, bless his wicked little heart, I love him. Because we were telling him about those samples, and he asked, he said, well, what labs could they send them to? Well, there were only 5 in the country that could do those kinds of samples at that point. And one was Harvard, one was University of Nebraska, one was at Research Triangle Park, Dow Chemical was another. So he started calling them up. And when he got to University of Nebraska, he got Michael Gross on the phone. He said, oh, yeah, I sent those to EPA years ago and faxed them to us. And that was the beginning of the end of 245T, because EPA was falling all over itself trying to explain what happened. And Jim Weaver was out here and in DC calling for congressional investigations. And it was a circus in a way. But it turned out that at the time that EPA announced that those samples didn't come from out here, they came from Dow Chemical, they hadn't even decoded the samples yet. So there was no way they could have known where they came from at that point. And that started for me 4 years of negotiations and legal battle in court to get the actual chain of custody of those samples. And it turns out there was no evidence at all that they came from Dow Chemical, none. And it also turns out that at the time they announced that, Dow Chemical had a restraining order forbidding EPA to come and take samples there. So the Region 5 EPA officials are scratching their heads saying, what, they came from here? No, they wouldn't let us in. So the lies go on and on and on, and the upshot of it all is that we are all still exposed to 2,4-D, to glyphosate, to atrazine, to a string of other chemicals, but those are good enough for now, that all were originally tested by industrial biotest laboratories, and they're still on the market because EPA and the chemical industry got together for what I call the Howard Johnson Conference. It was remarkably, they had a court reporter there. And there's a whole transcript, it's like 300 pages or something, of these EPA and industry and health, whatever it's called, Canada, representatives, and their sole purpose in getting together at this Howard Johnson's Inn in Arlington, Virginia, was to decide how they're going to keep these chemicals on the market now that we know that all the testing was fraudulent. And that was the purpose. And it's a remarkable transcript, believe me, because it's very apparent that they're going to keep these chemicals on the market no matter what. And that's what they did. And they're still on the market today. And it doesn't matter that they say there were corroborating studies, but those studies came from 88 other labs that had the same problems as industrial biotest labs. That with fraudulent testing, with non-existent testing, what they called magic pencil studies, which means they just made them up. And it's against fraud like that that communities are fighting. And it's the fraud like that that underlies the use of these things that now constitutes the approved, USDA-approved conventional agriculture. And the only hope is for, I think, the community rights movement to keep growing and keep insisting that we have the right to protect ourselves, that we have a right to not to be exposed to these things without our informed consent, and we have a right as communities to protect all of our communities, including the ecosystem, from being poisoned, especially poisoned for no reason except to make a profit. You know, and it might be one thing if there was some horrible thing that happened where some plague upon us, but the plague that's upon us is these poisons, and it has to be stopped. And the other thing I would like to see, and maybe it's a pipe dream, but if these corporations have human rights, according to the Supreme Court, well, damn it, they should be subject to capital punishment just like an individual would be.
Well, I'd just like to say how glad I am to see all these familiar faces and family and friends and new faces. I've been in a lot of these kind of meetings where I'm up at the front and kind of thinking about, you know, where we're going as a community. You know, and I think the community rights movement really has come about because people are thinking about what they want for their community. And I think it's really important that we all think about what we want for our future. And, you know, when it comes down to our story, we had meetings and we got together, but really it came down to, you know, all these people that kept talking to us about what was happening, right? All these stories that kept, you know, coming up about people getting sick, cancers. You know, I've been an Oregonian my whole life. I grew up in the Coast Range, went to high school here in Eugene, so I kind of like was away for a little bit, but now I'm back in Newport. And, you know, I go up the gorge. That's where I hang out, and, you know, when I want to get away, and it's up the Siletz River. And that's where about 5 cities get their water from. And when we thought about things to get people motivated, because unfortunately, as community rights activists, you need to kind of figure out what's going to get people motivated. You know, what, you know, and, you know, I heard this guy say, you know, you don't have to be an activist all the time, but it has to be, you know, at least a hobby, right? And so I'd say that we were all kind of hobbyists. None of us really had any, you know, experience. No one had ever been part of a nonprofit group. Definitely no one had been at meetings every week for 2 hours. You know, and we decided to write an ordinance. You know, we worked with CELDIF and the lawyers from the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund to write a law that we would then take to the voters. And so the idea was that the government had let us down, right? I mean, here's Carol leading the charge. When I was a kid, I was actually living out in Five Rivers at that time, you know, in the 80s. And we saw this firsthand. And how can it be now that I'm 42 that the same things keep going on over and over again? And so we decided that we would take matters into our own hands, because we felt like that was not just the only option, but the real true option that felt good in our hearts. Because the key thing that we all have to remember is that the only thing that motivates us is truth, right? And so I want to just talk a little bit about the truths that we brought out during our campaign. We were overspent, almost 10 to 1. And so there was a lot of messaging going around. And, as me being the younger person in the group and more tech savvy, it kind of came down for me to kind of assimilate this messaging that we would try to get out. Because now, we'd gotten all the signatures, we had gotten through some court battles, thanks to Ann, and we were finally in the campaign mode. And honestly, we had all talked about that before, what that was going to be like, and we had looked at the spreadsheets and the graphs about, how we were going to reach the 40,000 people in our county, right? But when it really came down to it, we thought about what really matters to people, what's really important. And to us, it's about water. And I just wanted to show you some of the visual aids that I used, because I think in our society now, it's really important to focus on the visual side of things. And so I know this is going to be kind of hard to see, but right here on my little mouse right there, this is the Siletz River Gorge. So this is the river, and we're going from 1984 to 2016.
Oh, that's good. And tell them what the brown stuff is.
So all of the changes that have been happening to our watershed over the last 15 years, they really start to add up in people's minds. When they start thinking about where their water comes from, where their baby's drinking from, they start realizing that what's going on in the forest has a direct impact into their lives. And so it was our job to talk with the community and tell them why it was so important that we were the first community in the planet, I believe, to actually ban aerial pesticide spraying of clear cuts. The other thing that, I'm talking to the Lane County folks and people that are, in this line where we're trying to get people motivated, we're trying to get people, excited about helping out their community, and really personal stories, and people coming from the community. We had Carol's came and gave a talk that we had some video from. And I mean, having this stuff available to people, to see the stories, to hear real people's lives being impacted, it's really important. And, folks like Lauren Wand, that have, lost family members to the poisons that have happened. I mean, those were the things that kept getting stuck in people's minds, that even though the opposition outspent us 10 to 1 and they were sending glossy flyers that said, there's nothing to worry about, pesticides are safe, it only took a few of us. We have a very small core group. And I'm here to tell you that we can make positive change in our community. We don't have to be experts, right? We just have to give some time and work together with each other so that we can really impact the way our future looks for our children. And when you look at these clear cuts and you look at these stories and you start to see a community, the community chose health, right? The community chose clean water. They didn't buy into this tagline that the opposition just fed to them over and over and over again. And I'm here to say that people are waking up and they care about their community. And more importantly, they really want to make some positive change. So I think it's really important, after hearing these stories about, how the government stacked all these environmental regulations, we need to start thinking about what regulations we want. And we need to start implementing them on the local level and on the state level. It was definitely easier for us as a small community, only 40,000 voters. it makes it a little bit easier. But the idea is the same, that we have to talk to people's hearts, we have to tell them about their future, and we have to all make the decision about what we want to spend our lives doing. And for our core group, it was trying to make Lincoln County better, trying to make it safe so that when you drink the water, you don't have to go, God, I'm glad I have that filter on there. And I think that's the reality that people, there's this disconnect about what's going on in the forest. And so we, as ambassadors, really need to teach people about what is really going on in the forest, what is really going on in our community. And I believe that people are going to make the right decision once they see the facts. Right? I know in our community it was tough. We only won by, 61 votes?
But it did win.
We did win. And so this community now, it really changed the conversation. Just the idea of having it on the ballot, right? You don't have to win. You have to get this into the public eye, right? We've had so many meetings and so many times we got together, try to tell people. But when it was a hot item, every week there was 5 letters to the editor from the opposition, from us. The internet's all about people posting for and against, people arguing on Facebook, right? You really have to get it out into the public forum. With the community rights, what we do is we create local laws that then go to the vote by the people. And that means you have to think about it. But it also means that you can be the laziest activist ever. All you have to do is fill in a little bubble, right? And so I really, hope that Lane County can overturn these hurdles. I know it's been hard, and I know that it's, but the idea is being there, putting it into the public's perspective. The more they push back at us, this is all calculated, right? We're setting them up. The only way they win is by coming after us. That's how we got some of the new members in our group. He lived in the middle of the woods. He got this little flyer, glossy, 2-page. He found us within 3 days, right? I have to be with you guys. And unfortunately, when you hear what we're stacked against, the EPA, the government, all these studies, you realize now how important it is that we all come together, right? That we all come into these rooms, we all talk about these things, and then you go talk about your friends, right? What are we going to do, right? And what we decided to do was write this local law, take it to the voters, right? It was a lot of work, a lot of groundwork. We had a lot of help from Lane County, right? But we, as Oregonians, we're all connected. The rivers connect us all, right? We're all part of this ecosystem, and I really, I'm so glad that you came on the side of the Siletz River. You see these slides, you see what's going on. The first time I went up there, I went salmon fishing 20 years ago, and you drive up, and you're like, these clear cuts, and growing up in Oregon, you start getting used to clear cuts. You start getting that scab where it doesn't hurt quite so bad, right? But when you see what's going on now, the place they've taken it, right? This isn't normal anymore. This is industrialized forest, right? And all those clear cuts get 4 applications of herbicides.
At least.
Right? The only rules they follow are the labels, is basically they have to spray by the label. And they've kind of gotten themselves in this spot where they're not doing anything illegal. And that's the absolute problem. And that's why we have to change the laws in our counties and in our state. And when we start looking at it, it's a global problem, right? But the canary in the coal mine here are the people that keep getting sick, right? Why is it a crime to live out in the forest? Why is it a crime to be out of town, right? What did those people do that means that they should be exposed to these chemicals? And, one of the letters to the editor admitted that they were paying $100 more an acre to backpack spray, right? You can't fly over someone with a backpack sprayer, right? And when you start hearing these stories about all the tragedy, you start realizing what a time to come together. right? It's not too late. Sure, it's been 30 years, right? But it's time for us all to start thinking about what we want in our community and how we're going to make it so that when our children's children get to go out to the river, we don't have to worry about them drinking the water out of the creek. You don't have to look at your tap and wonder if your Brita filter's still working. And unfortunately here in Eugene, you know, the water comes from places, right, that have clear cuts, right? And I'm not a scientist, and I try to stay out of the science. I say, read the label. Right on the label, it says it's dangerous, don't drink it, right? You say that this amount is safe, but when you start thinking about your watershed and you start looking at these photos, right, of the mass scale of the application of these, we have to do something different. And I'm really glad that we're all here, and I think this is going to be a long road. You know, I know that Lane County has got a long road. Lincoln County, you know, we have a long road, and the reality is, though, the base that we built is there to stay. No matter what happens, no matter what the court says, no matter what the opposition thinks they've won or didn't win, right? The base is there. We're all still meeting every week, every 2 weeks, and people are still thinking about their water. That's completely fundamentally changed the way they look at their tap. And then we also got to look at our government. How are we going to let this go on, right, over and over and over again? If we can't make the changes to protect our health, safety, and welfare in our community, then we need to change the way government's ran. And here in Oregon, we have the tools to do that. I really appreciate Lane County, the Community Rights Lane County, you know, their tables here. Please come find them. You know, I also want to talk about the other groups, Oregon Wild and Cascadia Wildlands. Some other people, right, we're all working on the same issue. And we've just decided to go at it a different way. But I think the thing about bringing that coalition together, right, so that we're all speaking the same language and we're all, you know, we don't have to have the same message, but the idea is, wait a minute, here we are, right? We're Oregonians. We're all in this together. We all live on the rivers. We all drink the water. And we all want safety, health for our families. So thank you very much.
I think we're going to take some questions. I just wanted to quickly clarify the law that Rio was referring to and was passed in Lincoln County was a community rights ordinance that was written as a rights-based ordinance. So it recognized the community and people's rights to be free from toxic chemical trespass. It recognized the rights of the water, soil, and air to be free from toxic trespass. And it also recognized the rights of nature. So it gave legal standing to nature to sue on its own behalf to be free from the chemical trespass. And because all of those things are essentially made illegal by this current structure of law, that is, state law in Oregon protects the timber industry, legalizes the aerial spraying, and the corporate rights that support the corporation's activities in terms of commerce, in terms of property, in terms of profit, are all challenged by this law. And so the law says in Lincoln County, they will not recognize the constitutional rights of corporations and the state privileges that have been extended to them through things like preemption, state preemption. And so it's a pretty radical law. It's still on the books, we're happy to say. It has been challenged by the timber industry, and the judge is still out on whether the law will be left in place. But as Rio mentioned, the incredible amount of work that went into it and the historical significance of the work that's been done and the challenge and the education that's been accomplished cannot be reversed. And hopefully people will continue to see what the system truly looks like. Evan and Carol are amazing spokespeople that evidence the kind of system we're up against. And it's not just that the government has failed to ban it and has failed to protect us. It's that they empower corporations, they defend corporations, they pass laws to support corporations. And so the work is much bigger than just tackling the regulatory agencies. The work is much more expanded, and that is the work that community rights, the community rights movement undertakes, and we hope you'll join us in that. So I'll just turn it over to the crowd for questions and see if we can take some questions.